Bobby and George's trip to the past, meeting Homo Habilis. Settle down, class. The order came from Mrs. Claude, the 5th grade teacher. I know that everyone is excited to learn about humankind's ancestors, but we must maintain some sort of decorum. The message, of course, was lost on the young 5th graders, many of whom had never heard the word decorum in their lives. Mrs. Claude was well known within the school for her traditional approach to education, hence her use of words such as decorum, as well as her traditional views on various topics. While this earned her some scorn from her fellow teachers and administration, the 5th graders in her class were hardly capable of distinguishing between her accurate and false beliefs. As the class slowly began to settle down, Mrs. Claude gestured to a poster on a nearby wall. It was a typical chart depicting an ape slowly morphing into a human. The title of this painfully inaccurate poster was, "How Did Humans Evolve? A Complete Guide to Human History." Before Mrs. Claude had the opportunity to continue on her misinformed tirade, which was to include something about how humans are the direct descendants of chimpanzees, a hand shot up. Mrs. Claude let out a weary sigh. Yes, Bobby. Bobby was a self-taught and self-proclaimed anthropologist, or archaeologist to be more specific. She was also the greatest source of annoyance for Mrs. Claude. Do you mean that chimpanzees are the closest living relatives to humans? Even then, they would be tied with bonobos. Scientists recently discovered that the two share almost... She was promptly interrupted by Mrs. Claude. We have been over this, Bobby. These ideas are not up for debate. Unless you want to go back in time and get pictures of the real ancestors of humans, the rest of us will go back to learning. The class erupted into snickers, which only grew louder as Bobby stood up, boldly declaring, I'll do just that. Marching out of the room, she was soon joined by her trusty sidekick, George. George was a technical mastermind and had, conveniently enough, just put the finishing touches on his time machine, though it was still up for debate whether or not it was up to code. We'll show her, George hollered, navigating to the time machine, which was in a forgotten closet in the westernmost area of the school. The two children stepped into the machine, with George pressing a series of buttons, a pattern complex enough that someone of his age should not have found it possible to remember. The next thing they knew, they were in the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, 2 million years in the past. The machine dropped the pair off in a densely forested area. Or was it a newly discovered savanna? Neither of the kids could be quite sure exactly what it was that they were seeing. One second the land seemed to take on a dry, arid appearance, clearly suggesting that long-term aridification had occurred. Like the savanna hypothesis, Bobby muttered to herself, this theory for early hominin evolution fresh on her mind. The next second the world seemed to speed up, cycling through bouts of extreme and rapid climate change. With each bout, the local environment seemed to change in drastic ways, and the extinction, speciation, diversification, and migration of countless species seemed to be revealed to them. The turnover pulse hypothesis, George whispered, parroting something that he had heard on one of the science shows Bobby loved so much. Then the rapid change seemed to slow down, leaving the children to feel the vestiges of a slow, encroaching sort of climate change, and a subsequent change in species and trait emergence. A few minutes of warmth, and then coolness, and then warmth again. This unpredictability must relate to the variability selection hypothesis. It was unclear which of the children had spoken. Finally, this uncanny, multidimensional experience seemed to solidify into something that was not quite concrete, but not nearly as abstract as the past few moments had been. I forgot the time machine depended on the current extent of human knowledge, George groaned, rubbing his eyes as if to ward off the last vestiges of his experience. Bobby recovered much quicker, already looking down at the colorful journal she carried everywhere with her. Yeah, there's a bunch of different hypotheses about how climate has affected human evolution. For example, the savanna hypothesis is supported by marine and terrestrial records that seem to suggest cooling and drying conditions. Isotopic records too indicate an increase in grasslands. Bobby supplied helpfully. Some scientists associate this with the diversification of taxa and emergence of bipedalism. Since, less trees means that the ability to move efficiently on two legs may have been beneficial. With all that evidence, how come the turnover pulse hypothesis is also pretty popular? George asked. Well, supporters of that hypothesis cite the ice age between 2.5 million years ago and 3 million years ago, which brought extreme global cyclical interglacial and glacial periods. So essentially rapid changes between really cold and pretty hot. Also, in the Turkana Basin, there's some faunal evidence that suggests animal species turnover and extinction events, likely associated with changes in habitat types. Maybe this is why our genus, Homo, persisted while other species went extinct. We were generalists while other hominin species were specialists. I suppose you might as well explain the variability selection hypothesis, George said with a sigh, knowing that Bobby would do so whether he liked it or not. Happy to. So the evidence in support of the variability selection hypothesis is pretty similar to the turnover pulse hypothesis, but it also thinks about the long-scale extinction and survival events. Their interpretation is pretty similar as well, but it also allows for a more fluid understanding of the emergence of different traits like bipedalism and the survival of generalist species versus specialists. So everything is really just on a longer time scale compared to the rapid changes in the turnover pulse hypothesis. Bobby finally took a breath. Anyways, we're looking for Homo Habilis, the earliest member of our genus. To find this elusive creature, it may take hours, days even. George interrupted her, unceremoniously pointing into the distance. Is that it over there? Huh, I guess it is. And indeed it was. Off a small distance away, there was a creature that Bobby and George immediately identified as the target of their search. Bobby gave her journal a quick glance where she had an image of Australopithecus. The way she had gotten this image was dubious. Compared to Australopithecus, this creature had a relatively large and rounded skull. The jaw also did not protrude nearly as much. I remember you telling me that Homo habilis has a relatively large brain size compared to other hominin species, George whispered, not wanting to start their current subject of interest. Yep, Bobby exclaimed, her excitement getting the better of her, before she quickly lowered her voice as well. Their brain size is, on average, about 650 cubic centimeters. Australopithecus, she angled her journal to show George the picture, only had a brain size of about 500. Their attention returned to Homo habilis, immediately realizing that there was now a small handful of them. They were clearly social creatures, and they alternated between walking on two legs and climbing the trunks of nearby trees. Let's get closer, Bobby whispered, not giving George a chance to protest before she began rapidly approaching the group. They seemed wary of the two children, though not necessarily aggressive. Their focus, it seemed, was more so on a carcass that was nearly completely stripped of meat. There's nothing even on the carcass, George said, confused. Shouldn't they be looking for some actual food? His question was soon answered. With surprisingly dexterous hands, one of the Homo habilis was using a stone to crack open one of the carcass's leg bones. The leg bone, with the marrow now exposed, was quickly swarmed by the other members of the group, including what seemed to be a young juvenile. It seemed they were all eager to get their share of this fatty, calorie-dense source of protein. This is different than Australopithecus, right? I don't think that they focus as much on exploiting an ecological niche that provided them with more protein and calories. That was George. Bobby nodded. Yeah, it's a pretty big dietary shift. But some scientists think that Homo habilis may have also used stone tools to process plant matter. It's important because their teeth are a lot different than some of the Australopithecus. They have smaller teeth with thinner enamel, which may have made it hard for them to independently eat some of the harder types of foods. By using tools, they're able to be more generalist. As if understanding the children, a different Homo habilis, a napper, was holding a stone core with one hand, while the other hand was being used to wield a hammerstone to strike the core with. The result was sharp-edged flakes that were perfect for cutting open bones and may have even been suitable for hunting, though their small stature didn't lend confidence to the idea that they were expert hunters. Freehand percussion, Bobby supplied helpfully, a feature of the Ottawan techno-complex. George checked his watch, which apparently still worked even this far in the past. Class is about to end. We better take our picture and get back. Bobby agreed, pulling out her camera and snapping a photo. Mrs. Claude is going to regret ever doubting us now. The end.